He warned her from day one. This world eats soft things alive. She heard him. She stayed anyway, because she didn't walk into Adrian Moretti's life looking for safety. She walked in looking for justice, for a sister silenced, for a truth buried under blood money and black SUVs. What she didn't expect was to become the one thing a ruthless man would burn his empire down to protect. One crooked tie, one decision, one woman who refused to be invisible, and a powerful man who finally chose love over legacy. This channel is home to stories about mafia bosses with iron fists and hidden hearts, about love that survives the unthinkable, and about family built from the wreckage of broken worlds. Because no matter how much power a person holds, the greatest victory will always be choosing the right person to come home to. If that hit close to home like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe. Every story here was made for you.
Adrian's fingers laced with hers, a quiet possessiveness in his touch as they watched the city lights ignite below. The news of Victor Castellano's spectacular failure was now public, a testament to a battle won not in boardrooms, but in the shadows. All of it, the threats, the risks, the whispered warnings, had led to this moment of calm. Lena leaned against him, the memory of her mother's medical bills finally fading, replaced by a security she'd never known. This victory was theirs, built on secrets and ruthless strategy. But it was the quiet trust between them that felt like the real prize. A silent acknowledgement that she was no longer just his assistant, but his anchor in the storm he had so expertly navigated. It was a strange kind of happiness, hard-won and perilously guarded, but it was real. This triumph, however, was born from a confrontation weeks earlier that could have ended it all. Adrian had met with a rival, Dmitri, a man with lifeless eyes and an aura of cold danger. "Moretti," he'd said, his voice a low growl. "It has been a while." Adrian had simply nodded, introducing Lena, whose presence Dmitri acknowledged with a dismissive, insulting glance. In the hushed privacy of an exclusive club, flanked by imposing bodyguards, Dmitri had revealed his hand. He spoke of the Bellamy acquisition, of Victor Castellano's fury. "He's angry," Dmitri had smirked, his gaze lingering on Lena. "You took something he wanted, seems to be a pattern." Adrian's reply was ice. "I take what's worth having, and I keep what's mine." It was a declaration, a promise of the war he was willing to wage to protect his investments, and her. The foundation for that war was laid in a tense conference room where Adrian had strong-armed his own board. "They're getting anxious," a senior partner with a scarred eyebrow had warned. "They say you're acting too quickly." Adrian remained unfazed. "The board fails to grasp the concept of leverage," he'd stated. An argument erupted about Bellamy's dropping stock and the risk of waiting. That's when Adrian played his trump card. "It won't stabilize," he announced, silencing the room. "Not with an FDA investigation looming." The revelation hung in the air, thick with shock. He explained that the information wasn't public yet, a piece of knowledge he'd acquired through his own channels. He laid out his plan: buy the company before the news broke, ride out the media frenzy, and then dismantle it for a massive profit. The vote was a mere formality after that. Right after that meeting, alone with him for the first time, Lena had to ask, "How did you know about the investigation?" He was evasive. "I have sources who provide me with information." She pressed him, asking what kind of sources. For a moment, a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "The kind you are better off not asking about," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The warning was clear, a line drawn between her duties and his methods. He acknowledged her sharpness, a quality he appreciated, but cautioned her that some knowledge was a burden. "There are things in this world you don't need to know, Lena." Something in his gaze compelled her to back down, and with a simple, "Understood," She accepted her first glimpse into the dangerous world he inhabited. That night, after her first day, the weight of his world felt far away. Her small apartment, with its rattling radiator and noisy neighbors, was her sanctuary. It was hers, earned without favors. After a microwave dinner, she texted with her mom, offering a simple, sanitized version of her day. Boss is intense, but fair. Her mother's reply was a familiar comfort. Don't let anyone push you around. But as she tried to sleep, her thoughts kept circling back to Adrian. She remembered the unnerving way he looked at her, the jolt she felt when his hand brushed her wrist. She had survived so much, her father's abandonment, working her way through college, her mother's illness. She had forged herself into someone who didn't break. Yet Adrian Moretti made her feel dangerously fragile, as if he saw past the armor she had so carefully constructed. At the corner table of a near-empty hotel restaurant, the tension was palpable. Adrian Moretti, looking perfectly rested, outlined the day's agenda over coffee. They weren't drinking. 3 meetings, he stated, his eyes on his phone. The first, at 9, was with local developers. The second, a lunch, was with the Castellano family lawyer. At the mention of that name, Lena paused, her cup frozen in midair. Victor's cousin, she realized. And that was the moment everything clicked into place. The sleepless night, the aggressive phone calls, the chilling security briefings. The danger had a name. But the anxiety hadn't begun at breakfast. It had been brewing for hours. It started when Adrian had knocked on the connecting door to her suite at 7:30 that morning, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Downstairs, 15 minutes. It had kept her awake since 6, tossing and turning, replaying the charged silence between them from the night before. She'd chosen a professional, controlled outfit, gray slacks, a cream blouse, a deliberate armor against the memory of what might have been if she'd opened that door when the silence stretched too long. It was an unspoken energy that had nothing to do with business. The business threat, however, had a very distinct voice. Hours earlier, that voice had come through the phone line, thick with an accent and rage. "Tell Adrian I know what he's doing," Victor Castellano had snarled on his third and final call of the afternoon. "It won't work." Lena had promised to pass along the message, her voice steady, despite her trembling hands. Victor's parting shot, "And tell him Victor Castellano doesn't forget," had echoed in her mind. She'd relayed it all to Adrian, who stood by his window, fresh off a call in rapid-fire Italian. His expression remained a mask, but a dangerous light flickered in his eyes. When she mentioned Victor had called her sweetheart, his voice dropped to a frighteningly quiet register. "Did he? Next time he calls, you transfer him to me." And the reason that threat felt so visceral, so real, was because of what had happened just after lunch. That's when she learned that men like Victor Castellano weren't just business rivals, they were considered active threats. She had been introduced to James and Robert, Adrian's security team, in a sterile glass-walled conference room. They weren't bodyguards, they were specialists. "We're implementing new protocols," Adrian had explained, his tone deceptively casual. James, a mountain of a man with military stillness, was to brief her on access procedures and something called threat assessment. That phrase hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. They handed her a new security badge and a small, discreet panic button for her keychain. "You press it, we respond. No questions," James had instructed. The need for such a thing felt terrifyingly real when Robert, the older, sharper of the two, quietly added, "Sometimes enemies don't care about collateral damage." Adrienne had dismissed her concerns as standard precautions, but his stone-faced expression told a different story. He left her with James, who warned her that being under Adrienne's protection meant that to get to her, someone would have to go through them first. This cryptic world of obligations and enemies had been hinted at even earlier. At noon, a man named Marcus had appeared with sandwiches, a welcome break in a day that felt like drinking from a fire hose. He'd perched on her desk, offering friendly advice on surviving Adrienne's brutal pace. "You learn the rhythm," he'd said with a laugh, calling his boss a machine who could outthink anyone on 4 hours of sleep. But when Lena, trying to sound casual, asked about Adrian's personal life, Marcus grew cautious. He explained that Adrian didn't have one, he had work and other obligations. The kind, he'd said carefully, that kept him busy when he wasn't at the office. My advice, Marcus had concluded, don't dig too deep. Adrian values discretion. He left her with a half-eaten sandwich and a mind churning with questions about what those obligations could possibly be. But Lena's very first exposure to this high-stakes world, the real beginning of it all, had happened the moment she walked into the office on her second day. 20 minutes after she'd arrived, Adrian had emerged from his office, fresh from a verbal battle she'd overheard through the door. Close it or kill it. Your choice, he'd snapped into the phone before ending the call. He requested coffee, noted her recall of how he took it, and began sorting through his messages. His calm shattered when he saw the note she'd taken. His jaw tightened. When did he call? He'd asked. 8:15, she'd told him. He'd said it was urgent. Everything's urgent with Victor, Adrian had muttered, crumpling the note and tossing it in the trash, instructing her to tell Victor he was indefinitely unavailable if he called again. When she asked who Victor was, Adrian's eyes met hers, and for a split second, she saw something more than professional rivalry. He's a competitor, he'd said, his tone turning the word into something that sounded more like a declaration of war. The news broke just before dawn on their third day in Chicago. From the window of his suite, Adrian watched the city lights flicker as a news anchor announced the series of raids on Victor Castellanos' properties. Bribery, fraud, money laundering, it was all there. Justice, served cold and efficient. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Lena stood by the door connecting their suites, a tablet in her hand displaying the same catastrophic news for their rival. It was over. But that decisive victory was merely the final move in a game that had been set in motion 48 hours earlier, in the dim, private back room of a restaurant that didn't have a sign. There, Adrian had laid out his terms to 3 powerful men. Victor has been cutting corners for years, he'd said, his voice a calm, chilling blade. Falsifying reports, bribing inspectors. It would be a shame if someone decided to look into that. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Sal, the oldest of the men, had looked at him with a mix of respect and fear. You're playing a dangerous game, he'd warned. Adrian's smile had been cold. I'm playing the only game that matters. He had wanted a war. He would get one. That meeting, however, was only possible because of the work done during the 2-hour flight from New York. While the ground fell away beneath them, Adrian had transformed their luxurious private jet into a war room. With his laptop open and phone pressed to his ear, he spoke in a seamless mix of English and Italian, orchestrating the pieces of his counterattack. Lena had watched, taking notes when asked, pulling files when needed, a silent observer to a master strategist at work. Another city, another black SUV, another chessboard waiting for the next move. And the flight itself was a direct consequence of a single, 30-second phone call that had shattered the morning's quiet. Put Adrian on, Victor Castellano had demanded, his voice dripping with arrogance. Lena had patched him through without a word. Through the glass walls of his office, she saw Adrian's posture harden, his face becoming a mask of stone as he listened. He didn't speak. After half a minute, he hung up the phone mid-sentence, the storm breaking. Pack a bag, he'd commanded, already moving. We're going to Chicago. We leave in 20 minutes. There was no room for questions, only action. In 18 minutes, they were in an SUV, heading for the airfield. It was the very danger he had warned her about just the day before. The call hadn't been the start of the war, only the first public shot. He had seen it coming. Victor Castellano isn't a businessman, Adrian had told her, his voice low and intense as he stood impossibly close. He's a predator, and predators hunt soft targets. That word again. Soft. I'm not soft, she had insisted, chin held high. His hand had risen, his touch a shocking contradiction to his harsh words as his fingers brushed her jaw. No, he'd agreed, his voice softening just a fraction. You walked into my world wearing hope like armor. That's the softest thing I've ever seen. Her breath had hitched. Hope isn't weakness. In my world it is, he'd murmured, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. But maybe that's what makes you dangerous. He'd seen something in her, something that made him rethink rules he'd sworn by for years. But he hadn't known what. Not yet. He had simply stepped back, shattering the moment. Go home, Lena, it's late. The memory of his touch still burned on her skin as she'd left that night. She replayed his words, the raw intensity in his eyes when he told her she was making him reconsider things. It left her lying awake, every nerve alive with a dangerous energy that had nothing to do with her job and everything to do with the man in the next room. She knew getting involved with Adrian Moretti would end badly, that men like him only engaged in transactions and power plays. Yet knowing and feeling were entirely different things. She hadn't wanted to leave. She hadn't been able to sleep. Because a day earlier, the entire chain of events was set in motion by a simple warning. If Victor or anyone else makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. Understood? His gaze was unyielding. I don't care if it's a phone call, an email, or a look across a crowded room. You tell me. At the time, she'd thought it was just about a phone call, a simple moment of a territorial businessman. But Adrian knew better. He saw the whole board. He knew Victor's nature and understood that any move against him would require a disproportionate response. His warning to Lena wasn't just about protecting an employee, it was about protecting a piece on his side of the board that he hadn't yet figured out how to play. His associate, Lena Hayes. He'd introduced her that way to Sal, Marco, and Tony, men who sized her up and dismissed her in the same breath. They didn't see what Adrian saw. They didn't understand the quiet observation, the sharp intelligence that absorbed every detail without question. You did well tonight, he'd told her later, outside her hotel room door. I didn't do anything, she'd replied. Exactly. His hand had found its way to her hair then, his fingers sliding through the strands at her temple. You're smart enough to survive in a world that chews up people like you, he'd said, his voice turning rough. You're still here. That takes courage. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was too close, the air thick with things unsaid. And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't just her boss, and this wasn't just a job. This was a world of predators, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, he had decided to keep her safe. Ah, so that's how it was. This whole chaotic, dangerous whirlwind hadn't started with a threat or a business deal. It all began the moment a woman he barely knew walked into his office, and so it began. Lena, sitting at her new desk, had barely logged into her computer on her first morning when an external line rang. The voice on the other end was clipped, impatient, and accented. I need to speak with him now, it demanded. May I ask who's calling? Lena had asked. Victor Castellano. He'll know who I am. She explained that Mr. Moretti was in a meeting. I don't leave messages, Victor retorted. Tell him Victor called. Tell him we need to talk about the Bellamy situation. Tell him it's urgent. The line went dead, leaving Lena staring at the phone, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She wrote down the message, the first of many, and placed it on the stack, having no idea she had just taken her first step into a world of threats, secrets, and unspoken dangers. The last headline about Victor's conviction had been buried for weeks. From their penthouse, the city lights seemed to glitter with a newfound peace, a quiet Adrian had fought for and won. He wrapped his arms around Lena, the tension that had once been a permanent resident in his shoulders finally gone. He had promised to protect her, to build a world where Victor couldn't cast a shadow. Looking at her now, safe and smiling, he knew every risk, every cold-blooded decision had been worth it. This quiet moment was the victory. But it was a victory built on a foundation of secrets and betrayal, a war fought in the back rooms of Chicago restaurants and sterile office towers, a war that had started the moment Victor made his mistake. That war had ended not with a bang, but with the silent, systematic dismantling of a criminal enterprise. It imploded from the inside out, thanks to a flood of perfectly organized data delivered anonymously to the FBI. Financial records, offshore accounts, shell companies. It was a flawless roadmap to Victor's downfall. The news called it one of the most significant takedowns in years, speculating on a high-level informant. Only 3 people knew the truth: the man who had vanished, the man who had engineered it all, and the woman who had become the reason for it. The informant was a ghost now, living a new life paid for with his family's secrets. A deal struck over a tense lunch, where the stakes were nothing less than total annihilation. "My family will never forgive this," Paul Castellano had said, his voice heavy with the weight of his choice. He sat across from Adrian, a man cornered by his cousin's ambition. "Your family stopped being your family when Victor started using them as shields." Adrian's reply was brutally calm. He wasn't offering a choice, he was offering an escape. He slid a folder across the table. A new identity, a new life, a clean break. 24 hours after you hand over the files, you disappear. Paul's trembling hands opened the folder. He looked up, his eyes searching Adrian's. "Why this? Why now?" Adrian's gaze flickered to Lena for a fraction of a second. "Because he threatens something that belongs to me." In that instant, Paul understood. He closed the folder. "I'll need 48 hours. The night before that fateful lunch, Lena had stood in her hotel room, staring at 3 designer dress boxes she couldn't afford. A note from Adrian read, "Choose whichever you prefer." It was a gesture that obliterated the line between boss and assistant, a claim staked in silk and satin. This wasn't business. It was something far more dangerous. She'd wanted to march back into his suite and refuse, to tell him she wasn't a conquest. Instead, she'd slipped into the emerald green dress. It fit perfectly, a silent acknowledgement of a truth she wasn't ready to voice. When she knocked on his door, the look in his eyes, heat, hunger, possession, told her everything. This wasn't just a dinner, it was the beginning of the battle. That look was still there the next morning. She woke up in his bed, the Chicago skyline laid out before them, the reality of their situation crashing down. "What happens if Victor finds out?" she'd whispered, terrified. "Victor won't touch you. I promise," he'd said, his hand finding hers. "You're mine now. That means I protect you. Anyone who comes after you comes through me first." It was an insane, possessive declaration, born from a night where everything had changed. But she hadn't argued. She had kissed him, sealing a promise she knew could end in disaster, entirely unaware of the intricate plans already in motion around her. Lena woke to the sound of his voice, low and sharp. He was already dressed, standing by the window with his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what he wants," Adrian was saying, his back to her. The night before, a storm of passion and whispered confessions had given way to a dawn that felt dangerously real. His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the world she had just stepped into. He had warned her. Now that she was his, the danger was hers too. Lying in the tangled sheets of his bed, she felt the truth of it settle in her bones. This was the new reality. One night had changed everything. And as she watched him command his empire from a hotel suite, she understood that the complicated part had only just begun. The question wasn't if the storm was coming, it was whether they could survive it together. He'd asked if she had regrets. "No," she'd said, and she meant it. But as the sun rose over Chicago, a single thought echoed in her mind. What in the world have I done? It started with a look. After a night where every boundary had been shattered, Adrian's eyes held a question. "You okay?" he'd asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin. "More than okay," she'd admitted, her voice husky. The confession had hung between them. This complicates things. But things were already a tangled mess. He had tried to explain the gravity of it, the real-world consequences. My world, it's dangerous. People get hurt. He'd hesitated, then finished. Now that you're mine, that danger extends to you. She should have pushed back at the word mine, but in the safety of his arms, the protest died on her lips. Instead, she'd asked what came next. The plan was simple and terrifying. Meet with Dmitri and make him believe their connection was real. Isn't it? She had whispered. His hand cupped her face, his gaze intense. I don't know yet, he'd confessed, but I want it to be. They had spent the rest of the night unable to let go, as if clinging to each other could hold back the inevitable. That need for connection had been ignited hours earlier, on a bridge overlooking the glittering Chicago River. The air had been cool, but a different kind of electricity crackled between them. I need to tell you something, Adrian had said, his voice serious. He explained the meeting with Dmitry Vulov, a ruthless syndicate boss who would be scrutinizing their every move. He'll see the way I look at you, Adrian warned, his expression grim. He'll notice the dress, the dinner, and he'll use it. The danger was palpable. Lena asked why he would expose her to such a man. Because not bringing you would raise more questions, he admitted, his jaw tight. And because I don't want you out of my sight. Then came the words that changed the game. He told her Victor would eventually retaliate, and anyone close to him would become a target. His hand rose to her face, his touch shockingly gentle. I think he'd come after anyone he thought I cared about, and I'm starting to care about you far more than I should. The confession didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on the vulnerability they had shared over dinner. The perfectly cooked steak had been a backdrop to a different kind of unveiling. He had told her about the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety of protecting his father's violent legacy. It's exhausting living like that, he'd said, his gaze locked with hers. But it's the only way I know how to survive. He spoke of the weight of being a Moretti, the endless fight to legitimize an empire built on fear, and how Victor represented a past that refused to let go. His guard had dropped, and in response, she had let hers down too. He'd leaned back, watching her, and asked a simple question that unraveled her completely. He was tired of masks, he said, tired of the surfaces everyone in his world presented. He wanted to see behind hers. And though every instinct screamed for her to deflect, she heard herself give him the truth. I'm terrified all the time, she'd confess, the words rushing out. Terrified of not being good enough, of failing, of ending up like her mother, her dreams shrinking to fit a tiny water-stained apartment. I'm terrified that no matter how hard I work, it won't be enough. He'd asked if that was why she took the job. Partly, she admitted, the money was a lifeline. But also, she'd met his gaze. Because you scare me. Not in a physical way, she explained. He scared her because he was everything she'd been taught to run from, powerful, dangerous, unapologetic. But also because when you look at me, I don't feel invisible. The admission hung in the air, a crack in the professional facade she had so carefully constructed. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. My turn, he said, his voice low. For what? She asked. He set down his glass. Something true. And just like that, the roles of boss and assistant dissolved. He wanted to know about the person behind the professional polish. I want to know who you are when you're not being my assistant, he said, his eyes studying her. He explained that his world was full of people wearing masks, and he was tired of it. He wanted to see hers slip. It was a dare, a challenge wrapped in a quiet request. And in that moment, Lena faced a choice. Keep things light and safe, or take a risk. So, that's how it all began. Not with a threat or a command, but with a simple, disarming question about who she really was. Model. The trip had started so simply. A flight to Chicago, a car to the hotel. 2 days of meetings were on the schedule. The first was with a group of real estate developers. The second was a lunch with a man named Paul Castellano, a distant cousin of his rival, Victor. The third meeting was listed only as personal. Lena, focused on her laptop in the back of the SUV, saw it all as just another week on the job. She had no idea she was the centerpiece of a war she didn't even know was being fought, or that by the end of this trip, the professional lines would not only be blurred, but completely erased. Ah, so that's how it was. And it had all started just that morning. Marcus, a friendly colleague, had offered her some advice as she got settled. He'd lowered his voice, gesturing toward Adrian's office. "Don't take his words to heart. He isn't trying to be cruel," he'd explained. "He's just on a different wavelength than everyone else. Emotions aren't really his thing." Lena recalled the intensity in Adrian's eyes earlier, the way he'd stared at her lips. Sure, emotions weren't his thing. The thought was almost laughable now. Moments later, a message summoned her. "Conference room B, 5 minutes." She walked in to find him at the head of a table with 3 other men. "Gentlemen," he'd said without looking up. "My new assistant, Lena Hayes. Sit, take notes." And so it began. The wine glasses clinked softly, the sound echoing against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a sleeping city. "To boring dinners," Adrian said, his voice low and calm. Lena smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "And quiet weekends." They were safe in his penthouse, the threat of Victor a ghost of the past. This was the normal life he had promised, the one that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. And it was all because of a perfectly laid trap. The plan hinged on making Victor overconfident. Dimitri's men had fed Victor a stream of convincing but false information, leading him to believe that a crucial shipment was vulnerable. It was a setup, staged in a desolate warehouse district. Victor walked right into it, expecting a payday, only to find Adrian and Dimitri waiting. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase, just the cold, quiet click of a deal being closed. Victor's empire crumbled overnight, a lesson for anyone else watching from the shadows. That night, Adrian finally told Lena who the leak was. It was Marcus, he'd said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He was feeding Victor everything: Chicago, Dimitri, Paul. The betrayal had been a knife in the back, turning his own office into hostile territory. The realization had dawned on him during a tense lunch in his office, the air thick with suspicion. He'd looked at Lena, the woman he'd selfishly pulled into his dangerous world, and saw a target painted on her back. That fear, raw and suffocating, had been the catalyst. He knew then that he couldn't just win. He had to eradicate the threat completely. He had to make an example, the permanent kind, to show that betrayal carried a price from which there was no recovery. But to make that move, he needed an ally as ruthless as his enemy. That's why he'd gone to Chicago. The meeting with Dimitri was a high-stakes chess match. Victor, Adrian had stated, cutting through the pleasantries. He's not known for playing fair. Dimitri's laugh was like grinding stone. Neither am I. The negotiation was brutal. 60-40 split, Dimitri offered. My favor, Adrian countered without blinking. 50-50 or I walk. They settled on 55-45. As they shook on it, sealing the alliance that would doom Victor, Lena had taken notes, a silent observer in a world of predators, unaware that Dimitri's calculating gaze was marking her as Adrian's one vulnerability. The flight back from Chicago was heavy with unspoken thoughts. The city lights of New York had seemed to signal a return to a fragile reality, to the professional distance they were supposed to maintain. But the line had been crossed. Back at her apartment door, Adrian's quiet insistence on seeing her safely inside was the first crack in his carefully constructed armor. "I'll see you tomorrow," he'd said, a promise layered with meaning. Alone, her phone buzzed with his message. "Sleep well." And Lena. No regrets. She'd smiled then, a small act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. She typed back, "No regrets," not knowing how deeply those words would be tested. It was a choice she'd made, a step across a threshold from which there was no return. The whole storm had started so quietly. Lena walked into the office on a Monday morning, and the world was just the world. The marble floors were just floors, the glass walls just walls. Adrian Moretti was just her new boss, his office door closed, his voice a low murmur from within. She sat at her desk, pulling up his schedule, her heart beating a normal rhythm. His text, a simple "good morning," was just a text. The coffee she brought him was just coffee. She was his assistant, efficient and invisible. It was safe. Back then, she thought she was safe. But everything changed after that meeting. The one where three grim-faced men filed out of his office, leaving a palpable tension in their wake. "Lunch," Adrian had commanded, pulling her into his private world. "My office. Now." He stood with his back to her, his posture rigid. That meeting was about Victor. He turned, and the look in his eyes, weary, hunted, shattered her sense of security. Someone's feeding him information. In that moment, she was no longer just his assistant. "You can trust me," she'd said, stepping closer. "I'm not everyone." His fingers had brushed her jaw, a touch that was both a comfort and a brand. "No, you're not," he'd murmured. "You're the woman who's going to get hurt because I was selfish enough to want you anyway." That was when he'd laid out the new rules, the insane reality of her new life. No subways, no walks in the park, always a shadow at her side. It wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. "I won't lose you," he'd vowed, the raw fear in his voice telling her more than any business report ever could. The kiss that followed was desperate. A man trying to hold on to the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. He was terrified, and his terror became hers. He broke away, his forehead resting against hers. "I have to find the leak," he said, his voice quiet but lethal. "And when I do, I have to make an example." She understood. In his world, weakness was a death sentence. A knock on the door shattered the moment, and the mask of the cold CEO slid perfectly back into place. It was Marcus, tablet in hand, oblivious to the fact that he was reporting on a deal to the very man he was betraying. "The Bellamy board just approved the acquisition," Marcus announced. "Excellent," Adrian replied, his voice pure ice. "Paul Castellano called," Marcus continued. "Said he has the files." Adrian's eyes flickered to Lena. "I'll handle it personally." And just like that, the pieces of the trap were being set right in front of the traitor. That night, after the meeting with Paul, Victor's call came. The threat wasn't veiled, it was a promise. "Tell Adrian," Victor's voice had slithered through the phone, "that the people he cares about are never truly safe, witnesses to the deal." With the door shut, Adrian's attention was solely on Lena. "You're staying late," he said, his voice absolute. "Is this for the Paul meeting?" she asked. "No, you're staying right here. James will be outside." There was no room to argue. "I won't let Victor try anything while my guard is down. I'm not some princess you can just lock away. No, you're a vulnerability I can't afford." He snatched his jacket off the chair. "Stay put. Got it?" "Fine," she conceded. He stopped at the door, his gaze softening on her. "Lena, I get that this is more than you signed up for." "It is," she admitted, "but I'm still here." A faint smile touched his lips. "Yeah, you are." As he left, Lena slumped into the chair, her thoughts racing. Just 2 weeks prior, she was nobody, safe in her anonymity. Now she was a piece in a war she didn't grasp, claimed by a man who thrived in the dark, surrounded by threats she couldn't anticipate. And the terrifying part? She had no desire to run. The day crawled by. Lena tackled emails and scheduling issues, acutely aware of James standing watch outside like a statue. The floor emptied out around 6. The cleaners came and went by 7. By 8 o'clock, it was just her, James, and the low thrum of the building's HVAC system. Her phone lit up with a text from Adrian. "Meeting was a success. Paul's on board, on my way back." "Good," she replied. "How are you holding up?" "Bored, but breathing." "Breathing is good." Another message popped up. "Order some dinner. On me. Whatever you want." She couldn't help but smile and dialed the Italian place down the block with delivery service. She ordered pasta, breadsticks, and tiramisu, craving something sweet to cut through the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The food showed up 20 minutes later. She ate at Adrian's desk, gazing at the city lights and marveling at how insane her life had become. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but a gut feeling made her answer. "Hello, Miss Hayes." The voice was slick, accented, and eerily familiar. "We've yet to be formally introduced. I'm Victor Castellano." A chill ran down Lena's spine. "How do you have this number?" "I make it my business to know things, like the fact you're alone in Adrian Moretti's office eating Rossini's carbonara and wondering what this call is about." He let that sink in. "Am I wrong?" She glanced at the window, suddenly feeling like a target. 43 stories up, glass walls, lights on full display. A pair of binoculars was all it would take. "What do you want?" "Just a conversation." Victor's tone was almost pleasant. "Adrian and I have a history, but you're an outsider in all of this. Innocent. I'd hate for you to get caught in the crossfire because of his decisions." "I can handle myself." "Can you? Because it looks to me like you're just a chess piece, being moved by a man who's an expert at sacrificing what he needs to." "Adrian wouldn't what? Use you? Get rid of you when you're no longer an asset?" Victor chuckled. "Ask yourself, Miss Hayes, why did he really hire you? Of all the people out there, why pick a girl with no name, no connections, no influence? Nothing to offer a man like him." Lena's throat felt tight. "I don't need to hear this." "No, you don't. But listen anyway, because I'm offering you what he can't. A way out. Real safety. A life where you don't have to wonder if you're disposable." "I'm hanging up. One last thing." Victor's voice turned to steel. "Ask Adrian about Chicago. Ask what happened to the last person who got in his way. Ask him about Elena." The line went dead. Lena sat there, frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear, her heart pounding. Elena? Who in the world was Elena? The door swung open and she flinched. Adrian was standing there, his sharp eyes instantly reading the fear on her face. "What happened?" "Victor called me." Adrian became perfectly still. "What did he say?" "He tried to tell me you were using me, that I should be scared of you." She put the phone down deliberately. "Who is Elena?" The name landed like a punch. She saw him retreat behind a mask of indifference. "Where did you hear that name?" "Victor. He said I should ask you about the last person who got too close." Lena stood up and crossed her arms, waiting. "So, I'm asking." Adrian was silent for what felt like an eternity before he finally said, "Close the door." She did. He walked to the window, his back to her as he looked out over the city. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion. "Elena was my fiancée, 4 years ago." The air left Lena's lungs. "What happened to her?" "She died. A car crash on the FDR, hit and run. They never found the driver." His reflection in the window was like a stone carving. "The cops ruled it an accident. Wrong place, wrong time." "But you don't believe that." "No. I believe it was a message. They killed her to get to me, to prove that no matter how much power I had, I couldn't protect the people I cared about." He turned, his eyes locking with hers. "And I believe Victor knows who did it, because he's the one who gave the order." The office suddenly felt suffocating. "Can you prove it?" "No. If I could, he would already be in the ground." Adrian's voice was flat. "But I know it. Just like I know he's trying to do the same thing with you now. Just like I know if I show a single crack, he'll do to you exactly what he did to her." "Adrian, I should let you leave, fire you, give you money, and send you somewhere far away from this mess before it destroys you." He walked toward her, his hands clenched as if fighting an internal battle. But I can't. I'm too selfish, too broken, too desperate to hold on to something real in this life of deception and violence. Lena's throat ached. I'm not leaving. You should. But I'm not. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. You don't get to decide that for me. I'm a grown woman, and I know what I'm getting into. You don't. You can't possibly imagine what he can do. Then make me understand. Stop trying to shield me from the reality of it all, and just tell me. Her hands landed on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart. You want me? Then trust me enough to let me see everything. The good, the bad, and the parts you're afraid will scare me off. Adrian just looked at her, his composure finally cracking. Then he pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding her so tight it was hard to breathe. My father was a monster, he whispered into her hair. He trafficked drugs, guns, people. He hurt people for money and for sport. I was 16 when I saw him beat a man to death in our basement over $50. 50! And he killed him like it was nothing. Lena held on even tighter. I swore I'd be better. I'd take his empire and make it clean. Legitimate businesses, legal money, no more blood. His voice broke. But you can't erase a legacy like that. It taints everyone and everything it touches. Everyone who's ever gotten close to me has paid for it. I'm not Elena. No, you're stronger than she ever was. Braver, more stubborn. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. But that won't make Victor stop. It won't stop the dozen other enemies circling. It just makes me more terrified to lose you. Then don't lose me. Fight for me. Lena cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. You said I was yours, so prove it. Not by locking me up or making my choices, but by trusting me to stand with you. You have no idea what you're asking for. I'm asking you to let me in, to stop treating me like I'm fragile and start seeing me as your partner. She kissed him gently. I'm asking you to fight, Adrian. With me. Not just for me. He kissed her back with a raw, violent desperation, his fingers tangling in her hair as he pulled her body tight against his. When they finally broke for air, his eyes were burning with a new fire. Okay, he said, his voice rough. Okay. But if we do this, if you're really in this with me, there are rules. You listen to me about security. No exceptions. James and Robert are not optional. They're mandatory. Understood? Understood. And if I don't make it, nothing is going to happen to you. If something happens, he insisted, there's an envelope in the safe behind that painting. He nodded toward a large abstract on the wall. It has everything you need to vanish. New identities, accounts, contacts. You take it, you run, and you never look back. Adrian, promise me. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she would never run, that she would stay by his side no matter what. But the raw fear in his eyes silenced her. The words had frozen the blood in her veins. When Adrian arrived, his face was a mask of cold fury. He held her, his grip tight, protective. I'm going to end this, he promised, a vow made against her hair. Victor, the leak, all of it. He looked around her small apartment, a place that suddenly felt as fragile as glass. Not tonight, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tonight you're staying at my place. He was taking her to his fortress, a high-rise of steel and glass in Tribeca, with security that could withstand a siege. His penthouse, which should have felt cold and sterile with its minimalist design and priceless art, felt like the only sanctuary in the world. It felt like him, controlled, powerful, and a place where she could finally breathe. She hadn't known it then, but that was the moment their professional lives ended and their shared survival began. It was the night the assistant he'd hired became the woman he would tear the world apart to protect. And it all started with a job posting for an executive assistant at Moretti Capital, a simple ad that had pulled her from a normal life into the heart of the shadows. As the city lights twinkled far below, It felt like they were the only two people left in the world. He traced the line of her shoulder with his fingertips, while her head rested on his chest, their heartbeats finally in sync. The quiet intimacy felt earned, a sanctuary after the chaos. "Tell me about her," Lena whispered into the stillness. Adrian paused for so long she thought the moment was lost. Then, his voice was low, heavy with a past he rarely touched. "Elena, she was kind," he said. "Too kind for a world I was part of." He looked at a spot on the wall, seeing something she never would. "She worked for a charity my father used as a front." In his lavish apartment surrounded by cold marble and steel that felt more like a fortress than a home, he finally let her see the man behind the armor. "Come on," he'd said an hour earlier, his tie already loosened. "You can sleep in the bedroom." She'd found him leaning in the doorway, his jacket gone, looking tired but victorious. "Where will you sleep?" she had asked. He simply held out his hand. "Wherever you want me to." And she had pulled him into the room, not with desperation, but with the quiet promise of a shared future. With his arm securely around her, Lena glided through a sea of New York's elite, the whispers following them like a wake. She could feel every eye in the room on them, the collective curiosity a palpable force. It was here, under the museum's vaulted ceilings and dripping chandeliers, that they made their stand. Adrien Moretti, a man who for years had walked alone, was no longer hiding. He had brought his queen to the ball. "Smile," Adrian murmured, his voice low against her ear. "Give them something to talk about." And she did, a confident curve of her lips that betrayed none of the storm raging inside. They were a united front, a public declaration of war delivered on a tide of champagne and feigned charity. This audacious display was only possible because of what had happened that morning. Paul's files had hit the press, and federal investigators were already swarming Victor's crumbling empire of shell companies and offshore accounts. Adrian had made sure the right people got the information. He'd wanted a war, and now he had one on his own terms. His opponent was wounded, cornered, and more dangerous than ever, but they were ready. Their preparation had been meticulous, starting the day before. Lena had woken to find Adrian already on the phone, his rapid-fire Italian a clear sign of commands being issued. After he hung up, he'd turned to her. "We're leaving in an hour," he'd said, his tone all business. "Wear something that says you belong at my side." She found the perfect outfit, a charcoal pantsuit and a silk blouse the color of dried blood. It was armor. An hour later, they were in a private room at a Brooklyn restaurant, the air thick with tension. 7 men, soldiers and killers loyal to the Moretti name, stood as they entered. Their collective gaze was a physical weight, measuring and testing. "Gentlemen," Adrian's voice cut through the silence, "I'd like you to meet Lena Hayes." The oldest of the group, a man with scars and weary eyes named Sal Russo, stepped forward. He had known Adrian's father. "Miss Hayes," he said, extending a hand. Lena met his grip firmly, refusing to flinch as the 3-hour negotiation began. She said nothing, but she absorbed everything. She watched as they probed Adrian for weakness and scrutinized her, trying to decide if she was a risk or an advantage. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their suspicion gave way to acceptance. "You've chosen well," Sal finally said to Adrian, his eyes on Lena. "She's got a spine of steel." Adrian's hand found hers under the table. "I know." The meeting concluded with handshakes and pledges of loyalty. As they left, Adrian opened her car door. "By tonight," he said quietly, "everyone who matters will know you're under Moretti protection." And just like that, the final pieces were in place for the war to come. It had all been set in motion the night before that meeting. Tucked away in his penthouse, Adrian had finally laid everything bare. "Tomorrow, I'm meeting with my family," he told her, his voice low. "Not the business partners, the real family, the men who helped my father build this." A knot of dread formed in Lena's stomach. "Why?" she asked. "Because I need them to destroy Victor," he said, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. And they need to meet you. They need to understand that you're mine now, that anyone who touches you answers to all of us. The implication was terrifying, and he didn't try to soften it. They're not executives, Lena. They're killers. But once they accept you, they will die to protect you. And what if they don't accept me? She'd asked, the fear a cold knot in her chest. A chilling smile touched his lips. They will. I'm still a Moretti. The name was a weapon in itself. He explained then, his voice rough with a grief that had never healed. He told her about Elena, a woman who worked at a non-profit who believed in the good of people. I tried to keep her separate from my world, he confessed. I built walls between my work and my life with her, thinking it would keep her safe. But it hadn't. Victor knew exactly how to break me. He found the one good thing I had and he crushed it. I won't make that mistake again, he vowed, pulling her closer. I'm not hiding you. You're part of this now. You need to see it all. And at that moment, Lena finally understood. That future had been secured just an hour before in the marble-floored lobby of the museum. Leaving so soon, Adrian? Victor Castellano's voice had sliced through the air, dripping with venom. Adrian had turned, placing himself squarely in front of Lena, a human shield. The night is just getting started. Victor's smile was a poisonous thing. I just wanted to offer my congratulations. The Bellamy deal, the federal investigation, turning my own family against me. Impressive. He had stalked closer, his words meant to be daggers. You learned from your father, I'll give you that. Adrian's face was stone. My father was a monster. I'm nothing like him. Victor had laughed, a harsh, grating sound. No, you ruin your enemies. You take what you want. You leave a trail of destruction. The only difference is you wear a better suit. But the threat was hollow. Everyone in that lobby knew Victor was finished, and this was nothing more than the last rattle of a dying snake. Say what you need to say, Victor. Adrian's voice was lethally calm. Then get out of my way. He had taken Lena's hand, leading her away without a backward glance, leaving Victor standing alone in his ruin. His ruin had been sealed the moment he sat down at her table. Victor Castellano, he'd introduced himself with a chilling smile, ignoring her clear unease. We meet at last. While Adrian was across the room, shaking hands and securing his empire, Victor had launched his desperate attack. He leaned in close, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. I'm not trying to charm you. I'm trying to save you. Do you know what Adrian did to the last person who betrayed him? He spun a tale about a woman named Maria, an employee who, he claimed, had gotten too close and then simply disappeared. Victor's eyes bored into hers. That's what happens to people around Adrian Moretti. They either die or they vanish. Elena died. Maria disappeared. What do you think he'll do with you when he's done playing house? But Lena had held his gaze, her voice steady. I think your empire is crumbling and you're grasping at straws. After he'd stalked away, Marcus, Adrian's head of security, slid into the empty chair. He quietly dismantled the lie. Maria wasn't a victim. She was an accountant who embezzled $3 million and fled. Victor twists the truth into weapons, Marcus had warned. Don't let him get in your head. The whole evening had been a battlefield of twisted truths. Before Victor's gambit, there was Vivian Chen, a striking brunette in scarlet who greeted Adrian like a long-lost rival. And you look deliciously domestic, she'd purred, her eyes raking over Lena. Going to introduce me to your companion? The introduction was tense, Vivian's handshake a quick, assessing squeeze. Tell me, dear, she'd said, her smile sharp as glass. How does one go from assistant to arm candy? I'm always looking for career advancement tips. Lena felt Adrian tense, but her own smile was sweet as poison. I'd say the same way one goes from new money to old pretensions, careful positioning and a willingness to play the part. Vivian's eyes flashed, but Adrian had already been steering Lena away. Sorry about that, he'd murmured. Vivian and I have history. But Lena had barely registered it. She was too busy playing her own part, moving through the crowd of billionaires and politicians, charming but distant, proving she was far more than just decoration. She was good at the performance, a careful dance of saying nothing while communicating everything. She'd been training for this role her whole life, after all. Though when she first met Adrian, the role she proposed was far more dangerous than that of a beautiful companion. In his stark, intimidating office 6 months prior, she wasn't applying for an assistant's job. She was delivering a pitch. She had laid out a dossier on Victor Castellano, a man tied to the criminal underworld his father had once ruled. She detailed his vulnerabilities, his over-leveraged assets, the cracks in his organization. She knew things only a deep insider could. Adrian had watched her, his expression unreadable, as she explained her plan to dismantle Castellano's life, piece by piece. "I have the strategy," she had told him, her voice even, professional. "You have the resources and the access. Together, we can remove him from the board entirely." He had leaned back in his chair, studying the young woman who had breached his formidable defenses to get this meeting. She was offering him the one thing he wanted more than anything, a way to finally clean up his father's toxic legacy. "Why?" Adrian had finally asked, his voice cutting through the silence of his office. "Why you? What's your stake in this?" Lena had met his gaze without flinching, and for the first time, he saw the fire beneath her icy calm. "The charity my sister worked for," she began, "the one your father used to launder money? Victor Castellano took it over after your father died. My sister, Elena, found out what he was doing. She found proof." She paused, the memory a fresh wound. She was kind, too kind for his world. He had her silenced, and made it look like an accident. A file folder slid across the polished desk. It was all there. The evidence, the motive, her entire life's mission bound in manila. "You want to be nothing like your father," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Here's your chance. Help me get justice for my sister, and you can finally bury his ghost for good." He looked from the file to her face, recognizing a kindred spirit forged in tragedy and driven by sheer will. He thought of what Vivian had asked at the gala. "Wherever did you find her?" Adrian's answer echoed in his own memory, the absolute truth of it all finally clear. "She found me." With his fingers tracing idle patterns on her back, Adrian finally spoke into the quiet of the penthouse. "I got intel. Victor's making a move on Friday." He laid out the details, a big coordinated play during the Bellamy press conference, designed for maximum public damage. "We need to be ready." Lena met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "Tell me what you need me to do." He simply asked her to stay safe, to stay visible, and to trust him completely. In his eyes, she saw the unspoken plea, and she knew that placing her faith in him was the most critical part of the fight to come. This calm resolve was a world away from the suffocating tension in the car just an hour before. "I'm sorry," Adrian had said, breaking the heavy silence after they'd left the museum. "I shouldn't have let him get to me." Lena understood Victor had mentioned Elena specifically to make him lose control. "I know," Adrian admitted, dragging a hand over his face. "But I fell for it anyway." The weight of it settled on him. "Everyone there saw me threaten him. It'll be all over the news tomorrow. Moretti's violent streak, questioning if I'm no better than my father." "You proved you're not," Lena insisted, taking his hand. "You could have destroyed him right there, but you didn't. That's the difference." He couldn't see it, though. All he saw was a history of ruin. "People who get close to me either disappear or die, Lena. First Elena, now you're next." As the car pulled up to his building, his voice was thick with self-loathing. "Letting you into my life is a death sentence, and I'm too selfish to let you go." But Lena refused his narrative. "I'm not them. I'm not running. Stop trying to save me from yourself. We're in this together." That darkness was born from the scene that had unfolded at the gala. Victor had aimed his poison at Lena from the start. "Does she know who you really are?" he sneered. "About the deals in the dark? About Elena?" That name was the trigger. In a blur of motion, Adrian had Victor slammed against a marble wall, his fist twisting the man's collar. The entire lobby went still. "Say her name again," Adrian commanded in a soft, lethal whisper. "I dare you." With a final shove, he let him go. "This is your only warning. Stay away from my world." Even with his air cut off, Victor had managed a choked laugh. "Or you'll kill me like all the others." Adrian's smile was terrifying. "No, that was my father's solution. Mine is far worse." He adjusted his bow tie, his voice dropping to a clinical calm. "I will legally and publicly ruin you until your name is a cautionary tale. Then, when you're broken and begging, I'll let you fade into total irrelevance." He had promised to not just end Victor, but to erase him. He knew that the only reason Victor had invoked Elena's name was to find the one weakness in Adrienne's otherwise unbreakable control. Later, wrapped in sheets, Adrian had finally told her the whole story. He spoke of Elena, a genuinely kind soul killed in a hit-and-run orchestrated by Victor just 3 days before their wedding. He recounted the 4 years he'd spent patiently building a case, gathering leverage to take Victor down the right way, without becoming the monster everyone expected him to be. "I was prepared to wait as long as it took," he confessed, his gaze intense. "My revenge was a long game." He reached out, touching her face gently. "Then you came into my office and fixed my tie, and suddenly, waiting felt impossible." And that was how it all started. With the battle won, Adrian led her to his home office. He opened the safe hidden behind the painting and took out a small velvet box. Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Hold on, don't jump to conclusions," he said gently. "This isn't a proposal. We're not there yet." He opened it, revealing not a ring, but something else entirely. Just moments before, she had been wrapped around him, feeling the frantic energy of their victory fade into something real and solid. "What comes next?" she had asked. "Now," he'd said, "we start living. We prove that two damaged people can build something whole." She had smiled, suggesting a vacation with cheesy tourist drinks. Adrian's laugh, though raw, was real. "I'd like that," he'd whispered before kissing her deeply. "But I have to do one thing first." What she hadn't understood then was that this moment was the culmination of a promise. He had looked at her, his expression etched with a guilt that made no sense. "I almost got you killed," he'd said, his voice heavy. "I don't feel like a hero." But she saw it differently. "You saved me," she insisted, her hands on his face. "You've been saving me from the start, saving me from being invisible, from a life too small." He had shaken his head. "You did the saving. I just gave you the space for it." "No," she corrected, kissing him. "You gave me the courage to be more. You saw something in me I couldn't see myself." It was that courage that got her through the ordeal. And what an ordeal it had been. The press conference had reached its fever pitch when a reporter shouted Victor Castellanos' name. Adrian's face remained a mask of stone. "I'm talking about anyone who operates outside the law," he answered coolly. "Specifics are for federal prosecutors." Another reporter pushed. "But he was your main competitor for Bellamy." The room crackled with tension, but Adrian had been ready for it. The groundwork for this exact moment had been laid meticulously. He'd spent days on a razor's edge, anticipating every move. This was why, the night before, he had made her promise him something she never wanted to. "If anything goes wrong tomorrow," he'd said, his voice strained with exhaustion, "you run. Take the envelope from the safe, get in the car, and just disappear. No second thoughts." He needed her to promise because the thought of losing her was the one thing he couldn't survive. Not his business, his name, or even his life. Only her. Her promise, a whispered "I promise," was for him, a shield against his deepest fear. He had pulled her into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to merge their souls, telling her he loved her despite the chaos, despite how little time they'd had. She'd cried, whispering it back, and they had spent that night talking until the sun rose, forging a bond strong enough to face the war Victor was bringing. The war arrived precisely at 11 in the morning in the gleaming Moretti Capitol conference room. Standing before the mirror that morning, adjusting the same tie she had fixed for him on her first day, Lena felt the sheer weight of all that had transpired. Adrian found her there, his hands warm on her shoulders. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You can wait upstairs." She met his gaze in the reflection. "We're past that. We face this together." He had nodded, his jaw set, and outlined the security protocols. His men in the room, at the exits, security tripled. He knew Victor would have to try something. "This press conference doesn't just announce the Bellamy acquisition," Adrian explained, his smile cold as steel. "It exposes his crimes and paints me as the legitimate businessman who cleaned up the mess. It ruins him publicly." He knew Victor's desperation would make him dangerous, but also sloppy. "He'll make a mistake," Adrian had promised, turning her to face him. "And I'll be ready." Just then, Marcus had knocked, his face grim. The media was arriving. The trap was being set. Investors and board members filed in, taking their seats. Lena sat beside Marcus, feeling every eye in the room on her. She wore a simple gray suit and the diamond necklace he'd given her, an unspoken claim that she belonged by his side. When Adrian stepped to the podium, a hush fell over the room. He was in complete command. This was the result of the prior 3 days, a whirlwind of relentless preparation. While she had watched, the man who was her tender lover had transformed back into the cold, calculating strategist who built empires. He had met with lawyers, security teams, and federal investigators, coordinating the release of information on Victor's offshore accounts. He'd called in every favor, assembling an army of allies to withstand the coming storm. Far from being afraid of this ruthless side of him, she found herself loving him more for it. He was the broken man haunted by his father and the powerful man determined to be better. He was hers. He began by announcing the successful acquisition of Bellamy Pharmaceuticals. As cameras flashed, he laid out his vision, not just for profits, but for bringing life-saving drugs to those in need. He was every bit the legitimate titan he had worked so hard to become. Then, the tone shifted. "This acquisition also marks a commitment to transparency," Adrian's voice cut through the room. "In an industry too often plagued by corruption." A buzz went through the crowd. "I've been working with federal investigators to expose fraudulent financial practices," he continued, his eyes scanning the reporters. "Evidence of shell companies, offshore accounts, and systematic money laundering has been turned over to the authorities. Justice will be served." This was the culmination of a plan born from a trust she had decided to give him completely. "You're not your father, Adrian," Lena insisted, setting her glass down. "Even when you're playing the game, you're not." He had just admitted the wire transfers to Paul Castellano were real. He'd paid him, not for the incriminating files. Paul had offered those freely for a way out, but to ensure he could vanish and build a new life, safe from his family. Lena saw it not as bribery, but as compassion. Adrian worried the law wouldn't see it that way. But Lena knew federal prosecutors would never press it. Not when Paul testified that Adrian had helped him escape a criminal syndicate, protecting a key witness. In the quiet of the penthouse, long after midnight, the bone-deep relief of their survival finally settled in. The Bellamy acquisition was secure. Victor Castellano was finished. It was finally over. But getting to this moment of peace had been a brutal fight. Hours earlier, that victory had been anything but certain. The aftermath of the press conference was a blur of flashing lights and sharp questions. Adrian gave his statement to the FBI, then navigated a sea of reporters, his reassurances calming nervous investors and board members over the phone. Piece by piece, Victor's empire was being dismantled. Assets frozen, offshore accounts seized. The official charges were a laundry list of his crimes: money laundering, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted kidnapping. The investigation would drag on for months, but the final verdict was already written. Victor was going to prison. It was a decisive end to a war that had very nearly cost them everything, an outcome sealed only after federal agents stormed through the conference room doors with weapons drawn, shouting orders as they swarmed a defeated Victor and his men. Before the agents arrived, Adrian stood over his fallen rival, knuckles split and bleeding. "You're right about one thing," he'd said, his voice dangerously low, crouching to meet Victor's gaze. "I am my father's son. I learned everything he taught me about power." Victor was on the floor, his nose broken, the gun he'd threatened Lena with now evidence on the polished floor. "But unlike him," Adrian continued, "I know the difference between justice and revenge, and destroying you legally is so much more satisfying." That moment of triumph came just seconds after a burst of shocking violence. As Victor's doubt flickered, James had tackled the man holding Lena, while Robert disarmed another with brutal speed. Adrian had closed the distance in a heartbeat, his hand clamping around the gun, breaking Victor's wrist in a swift, vicious struggle before knocking him to the ground with a single punch. "That gun isn't loaded," Adrian had stated, his voice a cold, terrible blade of certainty in the screaming chaos. He'd read Victor perfectly, betting that his enemy was too calculating to bring a live weapon into such a high-security situation. He gambled on the bluff. "You're not actually a killer, Victor," Adrian had taunted, taking a step forward. "You hire killers. You're too weak to do it yourself." Victor's hand tightened on the weapon pointed at Lena, his face a mask of fury. He had her, a human shield against the consequences of his actions. He'd laid out his demands: call off the feds, return the files, issue a public apology. He believed he held all the cards, using Lena as the ultimate leverage, convinced Adrian cared for her more than anyone before. He thought he finally had the upper hand, that he'd finally found a way to win. The confrontation exploded when Victor and his men burst through a side door, turning a corporate announcement into a hostage crisis. The wail of the fire alarm, a manufactured diversion, faded into the background. "Funny running into you here," Victor had sneered, waving a folder he claimed contained proof of Adrian's own crimes. Wire transfers from Moretti Capital to Paul Castellanos' offshore accounts. He accused Adrian of bribery and conspiracy, of using the law as a weapon while breaking it himself. Lena's stomach had plummeted as she searched Adrian's stone-cold face for any sign of denial. He'd calmly stated they were legitimate consulting fees, a defense that only fueled Victor's rage and brought him closer, hissing that Adrian was the same kind of monster as his father, just better hidden. And all of it began with a perfectly executed takedown. On stage, Adrian Moretti had been masterful, his tone arctic as he addressed the room full of reporters. He never once spoke Victor Castellanos' name, yet every single person knew who he was targeting. With strategic pauses and carefully chosen words, he laid out the truth: that a competitor was using criminal enterprises to fund legitimate business acquisitions. The room buzzed with questions, which Adrian fielded with unnerving calm, systematically destroying Victor's reputation without uttering a single word that could be considered slander. Lena had watched, a mix of awe and terror swirling inside her as she saw investors nodding and board members looking satisfied. Adrian was winning, his empire rising as Victor's began to crumble. That was when the fire alarm shrieked. And it all started because he'd asked for that trust, even when every instinct she had screamed to fight her own battles. "I trust you," she'd told him plainly, sealing her fate with his. "Good," he'd replied, a darkness in his eyes. "Because Friday is going to change everything." Everything had changed, all in the span of just 3 weeks. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had first walked into this building, invisible and desperate. 3 weeks since Adrian Moretti had looked at her like she was something worth keeping. Ah, so that's how it was. Lena watched them, her heart so full it ached. This was the future they had fought for. This perfect moment, this family, this life built on choosing love above all else. With a gentleness that defied his reputation, Adrian held his daughter, tears tracing paths down his face as he counted her tiny fingers. "I'm going to give you everything," he whispered to the small bundle. Everything I never had. Safety, love, a father who chooses you over power, every single time. Their daughter, Sophia Elena Moretti, was born on a rainy October morning, named for the two women who represented kindness and sacrifice in his life. But this new beginning was only possible because, 2 years later, Adrian would officially sever the last ties to his father's dark legacy, donating the final proceeds to victims of organized crime and ensuring the Moretti name would forever be clean. Their life together had been cemented 6 months earlier, in a quiet ceremony overlooking the ocean. It was an intimate affair, with only their closest friends present. S gave her away, gruffly sentimental, and Marcus served as best man. There was no media circus, no lingering shadows from the past, just two people making a promise. Their honeymoon in Greece was 2 weeks of blissful disconnection, learning to be husband and wife without the weight of their world pressing down. They returned to the news that Adrian had been named one of the city's most influential leaders, recognition for transforming Moretti capital into a force for good. The article mentioned his father only once, a legacy thoroughly rewritten by his son. Lena framed it and hung it in their home office, a constant reminder of how far they had come. But that wedding, that future, had been set in motion 6 months prior, back in a familiar Chicago restaurant. "I have a question," Adrian said, his voice steady as he slid from his chair and onto one knee. The world around them faded into a blur for Lena. All she could see was him. "Lena Hayes," he began, pulling out a box holding a diamond that shone like a captured star. "You made me want to be better, to build something worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Through tears and laughter, she nodded. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her left hand this time, and as the restaurant erupted in applause, she knew their invisible, complicated past had led to this extraordinary, undeniable future. That proposal was the culmination of a year of hard-won peace. It came after Victor Castellano was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, his criminal empire dismantled, and his name reduced to a cautionary tale. It came after a postcard arrived from South America, bearing just 2 words from Paul Castellano: "Thank you." During those months, Adrian had steadily steered his empire toward legitimacy, endowing scholarships and funding initiatives to build rather than destroy. Lena, for her part, had silenced all doubters, her talent and grit transforming her from executive assistant to the indispensable director of strategic operations. She proved she belonged at his side, not as a subordinate, but as an equal partner in every sense of the word. But it all truly began with a different ring, on a different night. It started not with a proposal, but with a promise. He slid a simple, elegant band onto her right hand, a declaration that they were in this together. "I know it's fast," Adrian had told her, his voice raw with emotion. "I know we barely know each other in the ways that normal couples do, but I also know that I love you, that I trust you." He had just made her an offer to become the director of strategic operations, a position that would change her life. But this was more important. "This is a promise that I'm all in, that I choose you every day," he'd said. "And when you're ready, I'll ask you properly." And as she looked at the man who saw her when no one else did, she had simply said, yes, to all of it. The sun dipped below the New York skyline, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as their daughter's laughter floated on the evening breeze. Adrienne drew Lena close, surrounded by the family they had built from ashes and hope. "Forever sounds perfect," she whispered, meeting his kiss. This life, this peace, was their victory. He had told her then, his voice full of a certainty that had taken a lifetime to earn. "I love you, Lena Moretti. I loved you when you were invisible, and I'll love you forever." It was a promise sealed not in a quiet chapel, but forged in chaos and danger. To get to this perfect moment on their daughter Sophia's 5th birthday, they first had to remake their world. It required them to stand before cameras and reporters, with Lena at his side, as Adrian announced a new era. Moretti Capital, he declared, would now stand for integrity and innovation. It wasn't about erasing a dark history, but about learning from it. A year later, the Moretti Foundation was born from that promise, creating opportunities, education, mentorship, a real chance for kids growing up with nothing, the way Adrienne once had. Lena ran it, transforming lives with the same quiet strength she'd used to transform his. They hired people who understood the struggle because they'd lived it, people who had once been invisible just like her. But before they could build a new legacy, they had to survive the old one. The turning point came on a cold day in Chicago, when she finally told him the truth he couldn't see. He had to stop trying to save her from his world. They had to save each other. We did better together than we ever could have apart, he'd later admit. We made something good out of something broken. This shared strength was the only thing that saw them through the chaos that followed. The real question he'd asked her as they watched their daughter play wasn't if she regretted it, but if she ever thought about where they would be if their paths hadn't crossed. He knew his answer. Not for a second, because it brought me here to you. He was right. Their love story wasn't about being completed or fixed. It was about finding the courage to become more than they ever thought they could be, together. It was about two broken people choosing each other, day after day, through war and peace, danger and certainty, and in doing so, becoming whole. They built a legacy not of power or fear, but of love and redemption, a quiet revolution against the world that had tried to break them. Their story was never perfect or easy, but it was theirs. And it all started so simply, on what should have been just another day. It began with elevator doors sliding open, revealing a world of power and peril she could never have imagined. And with a woman who had spent her entire life trying to stay small and unseen, stepping forward into that world, looking at the king who ran it, and fixing his crooked tie. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.